Now let's turn to page 4 of the common problems that I found in your essays. Again, these are common problems. They may not be on yours, but it's not bad to hear and think about them so that you don't, maybe it's a problem you haven't made yet, it's an error you haven't made yet, or whatever error you can avoid. So I finished the previous video off with the discussion of, the argument, conclusion, opinion. How do all these terms fit together? And the most of you got them fairly close. But remember that the argument contains the conclusion, and the argument is a set of premises that supports a conclusion. And the conclusion really is your opinion. So now, another thing is there's a lot of verbosity, like extra words, like wordiness. So here I give you an example of that I more or less did see. Here's a fairly verbose sentence, to say the least. Something like, in this paper on Orwell, I am going to be discussing Orwell's famous essay, Politics and the English Language. Now remember Orwell's set of rules. I think it's number 3, where he says, try and be brief. So he says this in a variety of places. Is this word really necessary? If not, pitch it out. So in this paper on Orwell, I'm going to be discussing Orwell's famous essay, Politics and the English Language. If we apply this brevity rule, or this rule of trying to shrink the text down to the words that mean things, you could simply say, I will discuss Orwell's Politics in the English Language. Because you don't have to say in this paper, because I know the reader knows it's in the paper. You can just say, I will discuss. You don't have to say Orwell's famous essay, Politics in the English Language. You could just say Orwell's Politics in the English Language, because remember, if you formatted it correctly, we know it's an essay. And Orwell's, the Politics in the English Language is famous enough. You really don't have to mention it. So, and also, instead of saying, I am going to be discussing, a lot of people speak that way. When we speak English, we often speak in terms of a certain grammatical structure. Of this kind of the continuous present, or where, like, I'm going to be, or I'm going to, or discussing. We use the ing words. Now there's a bunch of technicalities of grammar that we don't really need to go into, but instead of I'm going to be discussing, you could just say I will discuss. It says the same thing. It's much punchier. Well, some grammarians might argue it doesn't say the exact same thing, but it is, for our purposes, a punchier way of writing. Right? I will discuss, rather than I'm going to be discussing, right? Again, so think about that when you're looking at your essays, in terms of how much you can just simply cut out, because it's not needed. It's just extra materials that it's not really doing any work. Another one is, modal terms, right? Like possibly, could, things like that. Some of you would double up on them and say could possibly. Just say possibly or could. You don't have to double up. And some of you would string a number of these things together. You don't need to do that. So just say could, or possibly, or might. You don't have to say could possibly, might be. Try to avoid them, because they can be a little bit of what we say, they can be weasel words, like perhaps or whatever. Those kinds of words, well, yeah, sure. You could always say perhaps. I mean, I just did it right there. If you're going to have an opinion on something, be clear, and there is, shall we say, a bit of a risk. You stick your neck out a little bit. You put your opinion out there and you defend it, rather than couching it in these coulds and perhapses and might possibly be. That weakens the aesthetic effect of your discussion. So avoid that. Just say I will discuss blank, whatever it happens to be, and put your best case forward after that. Parallelism is something that's not often thought about, but the mind and the eye picks it up, especially, and if it's not there, it can make your writing look awkward. What's parallelism? Well, I give you an example. Like, if here's an example which doesn't follow parallelism. In section 1, I will examine X. Section 2 will consist of Y. Section 3, when I get there, I will investigate Z. So I'm examining, consisting, investigating. So the way you're basically, if you're doing the same thing in all the sections, in parallel, you would write it like, in section 1, I examine X. In 2, I examine Y. In 3, I examine Z. So the parallelism, if you're doing the same thing in different parts of your essay, and you're trying to explain what you will do, and just use the same verb for each. If you're going to investigate in three places, you're investigating in three places. Don't try and vary the terms, right? So sometimes repetition, parallelism is a kind of repetition, but not all repetition is bad, right? And sometimes repetition works, it's effective, and sometimes it really helps the reader get a solid image in her mind or his mind, whatever. It just helps the mind prepare for what's coming. Anyways, you have to make judgments on that, right? So sometimes repetition is good, sometimes not. Sometimes it's redundant, and sometimes it's annoying. For instance, if you use the word very, some of you use the word very often. Very, very, very this, very that, very, very, very. Try and avoid that kind of repetition. But then again, there might be some times when, as George Orwell says, for every rule, there could be an exception, right? So sometimes using very might work. So you have to make judgments, right? So again, as Orwell says, let the context determine the word rather than just plugging in words all the time. I just always say very or like or whatever. So you want to make some decisions there. So that's it on parallelism. The last bit on page 4, run-on sentences, right? So that's when basically like comma splices, as I said, join two independent clauses. Some of you would have a sentence that really was like 4 or 5 sentences, and you just run everything together. So watch out for doing that you're not just jamming a bunch of different ideas into a single sentence, and it's just going on and on and on and on. You know, whiches and therefores and all kinds of things. And, you know, it clearly would have to be broken up and rewritten. That doesn't mean you can't use a long sentence. But remember, the longer the sentence, the more skillful you have to be with the language to use it. And we often in academic writing don't really use long sentences anymore. I know in earlier forms of writing, those of you that are in literature may love the long sentence. And I like it too. So if you read a lot of 19th century literature, big giant sentences, read a lot of older philosophy, John Locke's writings, and great English philosopher from several hundred years ago, huge sentences. Punctuation's all different too, so punctuation changes over time. But the long sentence, unless you're really, really good with your grammar and good with the language, try and avoid them. You can write in smaller, punchy little sentences. Orwell's sentences are small and to the point. Rarely do you get massively long sentences out of Orwell, at least in my experience of reading them. I haven't noticed too many of them. But again, if you absolutely think it fits and you think you can handle it, that's fine, but be careful. So it's also good to know your abilities in the language. If you're a little wobbly on grammar, don't do it. So I talk a little bit more, so run-on sentences. So page 5. Oh, page 5 is, I talk about use and mention. That's good to know. For instance, consider, now remember I gave you the example of Plato in the mind's eye, seeing, where sees would be something different because it's not used in the standard way of like the eye sees and the mind sees, so the mind sees in quotation. Here's another one, use and mention. Let's look at the word sees again. The human eye sees colors. That's using the word sees, and it's using it in an ordinary way. But how about this? Look at the other sentence I give you. It's at the top of page 5. The word sees, and I don't say the word sees, I just say sees consists of 4 letters. So now I'm not actually using the word sees, I'm mentioning it, right? Because I could say something like let's say I said the sentence long is short. You'd say, well, isn't that a contradiction? Well, not if I'm got the word long is in quotation marks, because I'm saying long, as in the word, right, is short. I'm not talking about the meaning of long. I'm talking about the actual word. So long is not a long word. So I could say long. If I wanted to be even more reliant on the formatting, I could write long is not long. And if I put the first long in quotation marks, it's not a contradiction. If I don't put it in quotation marks, then I am saying long is not long. That would be a contradiction. Now, if what I just said totally perplexed you, that means you don't understand the difference between use, mention, and the way quotation marks help us distinguish. So have a look at this example. Some of you don't have a clear grasp of the distinction between use and mention. Again, have a look at my document, figure it out, get it right, and if you can't, contact me. Because in today, the distinction between use and mention comes up a lot. So certain terms, for instance, that people say, oh, you shouldn't use that term. As a matter of fact, not only should you not use it, you shouldn't even mention it. There are certain terms that even if you mention them, they're highly problematic, and some people will say it's highly immoral even to mention certain words. I don't have to go into that. There's always a scandal about that stuff where people want to mention words that are deeply offensive, but they're not necessarily using them. So use and mention is a very interesting and important distinction. So try to get your head around it, get it right, and if you're struggling with it, contact me and we can talk about it. Yeah, so that's, oh yeah, also expressions like and also, you know, and also, uh, just say and or also. You don't have to say and also, because what you're really saying is and. So careful about redundancies in meaning that are disguised by different words, right? So sometimes I'll see 2 or 3 words strung together, and those words are basically synonyms, or at least they're functioning like synonyms within the context of your sentence. And basically, that's just repetition. That's bad repetition, right? And also, that's bad repetition. Remember, repetition is a subtle thing. In rhetoric, it's sometimes in the art of writing, there is good repetition. Shakespeare was a master at good repetition, where he could just drive a point home. Some comedians, as a matter of fact, are very good at repetition. They establish the premise. Before they hit you with the punchline, they'll repeat certain phrases, and that really will put that deep in your mind so the punchline has a bigger effect. So repetition is not always bad, but there are cases where it is bad, and redundancies are bad. Parallelism good, redundancy bad. Again, if these terms are just, if it's not working for you, read this document over carefully, listen to the video again, and if you're still having troubles, by all means, book an appointment with me. We can talk about it. Sometimes it only takes me a minute or two to find out what a particular student's problem is, and I can solve it. So, don't struggle too much. Give it a good struggle. Contact me if it's going on too long. Another thing, not so much narration. I know it's an opinion piece, and I know people love to talk about themselves. I do it too. We all do it. But keep in mind that you want to get to the point quickly. If you're writing an opinion piece on something, you don't really want to be telling how you came to this opinion. And that's different than the support for your opinion. So I want to know what you think supports your opinion, not the story of how you came to that opinion. So that's a difference between sort of an autobiographical narration of your journey to this opinion versus why you hold it. So yeah, you may have come to the opinion because your grandma told you, which is fine. Grandmas are smart people. That's okay. That's not really necessarily the reason why you hold it. You'll say, yeah, my grandma told me about this. And then, think about something like, my mom was the first one who told me that the earth went around the sun. And I believe that. But that's not really why I believe it. That's the story of how I came to believe it. But then my belief was augmented by science and other things than simply my mom saying that the earth went around the sun, although she was right. So in that sense, you want to distinguish between your personal autobiographical story, your narration, and the reasons. So we're trying to learn the distinction between, the origin of your intuitions and reasons that you eventually put behind your intuitions. And that's the distinction between sort of a narration and an argument. So narration, mom told me that the earth goes around the sun. Argument, well, based on observational astronomy, etc., the earth goes around the sun. So I hope you see that distinction. So last thing before I sign off here is confusing words like less and fewer. Less is used with uncountable nouns like milk. Less milk. You wouldn't say fewer milk, right? You might say fewer bottles of milk because bottles of milk is a countable phrase, like 5 bottles. And fewer is used with, so less is used with the uncountable nouns, fewer is used with countable nouns, like cookies. So I give you an example. Everyone was astounded when little Billy asked for less milk and fewer cookies, right? Cookies are countable, milk is not. So less and fewer, get that straight. And again, if you're confused about it, read over the example. There's lots of discussions on the internet about less and fewer. And if you're still, confused by this stuff, once again, contact me and I can help you out. All right, so there's a number of problems to think about. If you committed some of these errors, well, I tried to point them out. And if you're not sure, again, read this document over, listen to this video, study up, and if you're still still giving you grief, give me a shout, and we'll set up an appointment, and I can help you out.